A new round of talks and fresh hopes for peace in Syria. As the regime and rebels exchange prisoners, we look at who else is still being held and why. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmakers are Syria's prisoners of war. The Syrian regime and rebels have exchanged detainees ahead of the next round in the Astana peace talks. The prisoner swap was part of the peace process being negotiated by Russia, Iran and Turkey. But that exchange of a few people hardly makes a dent in the number of those still behind bars. And new evidence has been published about the torture and mistreatment in facilities run by the Assad regime in western Syria. So, will that be a potential roadblock in the negotiations? With more, here's Haider Abbasi.
Prisoners of Syria's war. Members of the armed opposition are being exchanged for men from the regime. This time, it's 9 from each side. The latest prisoner swap, the third so far, is a confidence-building measure. Arranged under the Astana peace process. Since 2017, key players of the conflict have been meeting in the Kazakh capital, Nur Sultan, with the aim of reaching a permanent ceasefire. The parties will convene again on Thursday. Since the uprising began 8 years ago, Syria's prison population has increased to around 500,000. Amnesty International says most of the prisoners are civilians. Among them are human rights defenders, journalists, students, and peaceful demonstrators. The human rights group says inmates face systematic torture for both men and women. An investigation by the TRT World Research Center details the experiences of some of the female detainees.
And we have seen that the Syrian regime is actually running sexual abuse and rape as a stratagem of war across Syrian prisons and a network of prisons they have. Most of them are indeed secret. And we have seen incessant rape taking place by these Syrian regime soldiers and law enforcement police, in addition to interrogators.
The most notorious facility is Zeldin prison, around 30 kilometers north of Damascus.
فطبعا أول ما السجن هذا رهيب وفي ما بتسمع غير صوت الضرب والتعذيب وناس عم تتعذب ببداية دخولك لهذا السجن. بهي الحالة بتتم أنت ضمن المنفردات ممكن تتم حوالي سنة، ممكن تتم شهر، ممكن تتم سنتين. مثلا نحن كنا مثلا خلال وجودنا بالمنفرد.
Mass executions have also been recorded at Zeldin. Amnesty says at least 13,000 people have been killed in the prison since the war began. The fight against Daesh was won last month. Its remaining territory in Syria was seized by a US-backed alliance. Thousands of Daesh fighters surrendered. They're now being held by the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, a group mostly composed of the YPG terror group. The UN has previously documented cases of the SDF torturing male detainees. Many under their custody are from abroad, such as Shamima Begum, who joined Daesh when she was 15. She's since had her British citizenship revoked. Some European countries have rejected the idea of allowing their citizens to ever return home. They say it will be too difficult to prosecute the former fighters based on sketchy evidence from war zones. The one notable exception is Kosovo, which this past week repatriated more than 100 of its citizens who were part of Daesh. There's concern that if the other SDF prisoners aren't prosecuted or sent home, they'll continue to pose a danger, highlighting the dilemma of detention across Syria. Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, with me here in the studio is Fadil Abdulghani. He's the founder of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. In London, we have Omar Waqaf, the founder of Gnosis, a think tank focusing on Syria and the Middle East. In Ankara is Omar Özkızılcık. He's an analyst at the SETA Foundation and the editor of Syrian Agenda, a Turkish website monitoring the conflict. And completing our panel from Washington, D.C. is Larry Korb. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and was the U.S. Assistant Secretary for Defense under President Ronald Reagan and served in other administrations as well. Gentlemen, pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Fadil, let me start with you. Syria's prisons are terrible places. They were terrible places even before the war started. But when we see a prisoner swap now, Fadil, as part of the Astana process, does that tell you that we're moving towards a peace deal?
Not at all.
Why?
This is not actually detainees exchange at all. That's only very minor implementation of Astana. That's the regime still has more than 120,000 Syrian detainees. Almost lots of them, more than 82,000, are forced disappeared.
So we read the headlines, 9 for 9, 9 prisoners here, 9 prisoners there. Something positive's happening.
That's unacceptable from our side. This is not the clear process, first of all. We need to reveal the fate of the disappearance as a first step. Then every side should acknowledge what they have actually, which list they have. And this should be, the civil society should be engaged as a human rights defender, not only the Astana side. Where is the monitoring from the UN as well? So there is lots of conditions need to be established in this process actually. 9 from here, 17 from here. We are not talking about continuous process actually. And this swapping of those are not detainees, as I mentioned. Those are captured from this side and from this side. So they are looking for benefit, each side looking for his prisoners, which they are maybe military or forces or something like that. We are talking about civilians. That's the release of detainees, really, actually.
Okay, Ammar, has Fadil accurately defined what the swap is about? And do you share his cynicism?
No, I don't, because looking at the bigger picture is it's very important to get the Astana process going forward. That trust is consolidated between different parties, and the Astana process itself is very much responsible for a lot of reduction of the bloodshed and destruction that marred Syria in the past 8 and 9 years. So this prisoner swap, though tiny, is probably significant in the sense that it is, in the sense of confidence building, it probably goes a step forward. So looking at the bigger picture, I would say we're moving forward, and the various parties of the Astana process, along with the Syrian government, I think they're building slowly but surely bridges of trust that would enable them to put an end to this crisis.
Larry Korb, is this the kind of micro issue that needs to be sorted out step by step in order to build trust?
Well, no doubt about it. I mean, it really needs to get going. I noticed that Ambassador Jeffries is now talking about, reinvigorating the Geneva process. Hopefully they can discuss it there. The United States is losing its leverage because of the fact that it has decided to cut down the number of U.S. forces. President Trump has tried to get 21 other countries to sign up. Very few of them are willing to do that. And even if we can stop the fighting in Syria, we've got a humanitarian situation that the world has to deal with it, not the least of which are a lot of the people being held in these camps right now.
Right. Omar, so for those who look at this from the outside and they say Turkey and Russia and the Iranians are putting all their energy into this process, and after all these months, the fruits of it are 9 prisoners here and 9 prisoners there. That seems to be nothing. Is that fair?
Yeah, actually, if we look on this case, it's actually nothing. So I would be something between what the previous commentators had said, that this incident, yes, is a small step forward in the Astana process, but the Astana process is much more than a prisoner exchange. But I don't think that this is single prisoner exchange will help facilitate the release of detainees in Assad regime prisons. Actually, there are so many that this is almost nothing. And over the recent years, the Syrian opposition had made many prisoner exchanges with the Assad regime, but there is a misbalance between both sides because the Assad regime has so many detainees in its prisons that even if all of the prisoners inside in the hands of the Syrian opposition would be exchanged, there would be still several thousands of detainees in Assad regime prisons which are tortured day by day and raped. So I don't think that this is the right method to solve this issue. I think there needs to be a general amnesty from the Assad regime side, and this has to be the goal, not an equal, balanced prisoner exchange.
Okay, so Ammar, the man's right, isn't he? When we look at something like Saidnaya, the notorious prison where Amnesty says more than 13,000 people have been killed since the start of the war. There is a massive imbalance here between other forces, whether they are from the Free Syrian Army, Hayat Tahrir Sham, whoever they might be, the SDF and their prisoners, and what is an institutional imprisonment and torture of people under the Assad regime.
Well, we've heard so many reports coming out and accusing the Syrian government of all sorts of things. They are pretty much based on certain and individual testimonies, which is fine. People have been tortured. We've heard this over and over again. Fine. To jump forward and say this has been pretty much systematic needs a proof. We just cannot claim this per se. I personally need to be convinced. But let me give you the other point of view. A lot of the Syrian, there are other Syrians who have stood against what you call the revolution. They've been expecting, for example, when Ghouta was liberated, to get something between 4,500 and 5,000 detainees by the Free Syrian Army or Jaish al-Islam and whatever in Ghouta, and only 200 came out. So there is a lot of research to be made on both sides, so to speak.
Okay.
And it's not only one side that is suffering.
Fadil Abdulghani, it's not systematic, and everybody has blood on their hands, or everybody has the torture and the detaining of prisoners on their hands, and maybe it's not so bad on the Assad side, according to Ammar. What do you think, Fadil?
If he doesn't believe in what Syrian Network for Human Rights have as a national organization and our database, let's go to the Commission of Inquiry and 37 report. From the first report, they mentioned that the violation from the Syrian regime is systematic and widespread based on, now they have more than 4,000 interviews, direct interviews with the released victims. This is the first one. Okay, let's move the Commission of Inquiry, which is like forbidden to enter Syria from the Assad regime. Let's move to the General Assembly and go to the resolution of all the General Assembly resolution towards Syria. It's all condemned the systematic and the widespread torture and for enforced disappearance from the Syrian government. It's mentioned in all resolution. Let's move for international organization like Amnesty International. So we have tens of thousands of evidence, and Human Rights Watch, and they all of them they mentioned that this is systematic, and we need to compare the scale. Actually, as I mentioned, Assad regime has above than 120,000. All the other party, they have less than 15,000 based on our database, and that's showing actually the scale of the people who has been arrested or disappeared. The second issue, we need to compare also the outcome. The outcome was that the torture still taking place actually while the Astana is processing. And as you mentioned, how much the total exchange of from the prisoner in Astana process, how much? Less than 500. That's what, if we need to continue like this, we need like more than 100 years and almost they will gonna to die due to torture.
Right. Let me ask you then, is there any level of acceptance you will have for dealing with Assad until there is accountability for what's happening in the prisons?
Yes, of course there is, but I'm refusing the word of amnesty. Assad is a criminal and accused criminal actually from the several bodies of international human rights organization. So this is unacceptable to give amnesty, actually. He is accused of crimes against humanity and war crime as a leader of the Syrian army. So this is the first point.
You want accountability.
We want accountability. No, not before,
process.
but till now. Till now, there is process and there is pressure should be taking place. For example, the sanction. Now, the effect of sanction is finally, and referring to the sanction, I need here to mention the information that till this moment, in spite of all those crimes against humanity and war crimes from Assad regime, the UN or the UN Security Council doesn't implement sanction against Assad regime. It's only from United States, EU, Turkish government, Canadian, individual.
Russia and China, yes.
Yeah,
but that's politics, right?
That's politics.
Right.
But this sanction will affect and will pressure the regime. It might be like eliminate the sanction and release those detainees and saving their life. And we need to remind also what happened with the death certificate when the Assad regime is simply announced through civil registry, which is like institution in the Syrian government, and announce about 900 cases for the families that, okay, your children or your father or your relative just dead through the civil registry. What is this? How this regime dealing with the population?
Ammar?
Yeah, I mean, the sanctions are not going to prevent President Assad from buying, you know, the next PlayStation to his kid or whatever. It's the Syrian people who are getting hurt, and the Syrian people who did not join with the revolution for valid fears against their beings, against their interests, and so on and so forth. We need to acknowledge that calling for these sanctions from the very beginning affected ordinary people. It didn't affect what you call the regime or the high-ranking people. Nobody is condoning torture, by the way. Torture is endemic in the whole region. It's probably the case because Syria is under war that is dividing the country and everything, that we see it on a much larger scale. But the other parties in that war aren't really clean-handed as well. And if you tell me that, you know, this is systemic, I need a proof. That's all that is to say. Hundreds of thousands of people have been affected, yes. Tens of thousands being imprisoned, questioned, I would say yes. But at the end of the day, let's not turn this into, you know, what people try to do is...
But the man gave you a list of organizations, including the Commission of Inquiry. Let me bring in Omar Özkızılcık because, Omar, you're shaking your head in disagreement. Tell me why.
Yeah, because it's almost funny to claim that there is no proof and that he needs proof. There are thousands of proof, and it's like denying the extent of the sun, that to deny the systemic torture in the Assad regime prisons. There are actual inmates' pictures who were leaked, and it's a known fact. Yeah, I don't want to discuss this anymore. So if he cannot accept this and needs another proof, I think there's something different in play here. However, if we go into the systemic torture of the Assad regime, there is also one important aspect, and this is the strategy of war the Assad regime used to rape the prisoners, especially women prisoners. And there are thousands of women being raped in the prisons of the Assad regime, and who came out with a child in their hands. And also male prisoners are being raped by the Assad regime, and most of them are ashamed of speaking about it. So we have all of these, and I think here we need to focus on releasing these unjustified prisoners. But however, I think we need also a realistic approach. It's hard to convince the Assad regime to release these prisoners, as they have used it as a strategy since the very beginning. Therefore, and also even before, and therefore I would argue that an amnesty declared by the Assad regime is a more face-saving option for the Assad regime, which can be achieved if we look on this from a realistic point of view. But however, if the word would be just, the Assad regime have to be on the International Criminal Court only for this torture alone, it would be enough.
Larry Korb, as we look at all sides and claims against all sides regarding prisoners and torture, we look at the SDF, the US ally. Folded within the SDF is the YPG, considered by Turkey to be a terrorist group. Strong claims that they are torturing those who are suspected of being Daesh or ex-Daesh and doing terrible things to them. Is there no real appetite from the Americans to look at that because these guys helped defeat ISIS?
Unfortunately, you're right. I mean, the United States a long time ago made a decision really not to play a major role in Syria. We only got involved after ISIS started in Iraq and then came over and made their capital in Raqqa. And our goal was to defeat ISIS. And unfortunately, we haven't paid much attention to these other issues. We've had a couple of people who were ISIS who've tried to come back to the United States. We already turned down one person. We're trying to help get people that we've captured from other countries to go back, but a lot of other countries are afraid to have them. They don't know how they can prosecute them. And unfortunately, I think when this conflict ends, it's going to have to be the major powers, Turkey, Russia, the United States, who basically have a ceasefire, set up a federal system, and basically are going to let a lot of people get away with things that they shouldn't have done. But the fact of the matter is, Assad's going to stay in power, and because he will, he is never going to be punished for the things that he has done. So that's the best we can hope for, is have a ceasefire and have a federal state in which you can have safe areas for a lot of the people who have suffered needlessly. And I think a lot of people in Syria and Iraq, who comprise the majority of people that are being held in these camps, are going to have to allow to go back to their normal lives. Hopefully the Geneva meeting will accomplish something, but I'm not very optimistic given the little leverage that the United States has.
Right. And let me ask you, Professor Korb, looking at the disagreement over prisoners here, just looking at that one issue as a microcosm for the disagreement over the other political issues, over choosing a constitutional committee and so on, not being able to agree on names. With this in mind, how hard is it going to be for all stakeholders to agree on the members of a constitutional committee getting together and deciding on a roadmap to peace?
Well, I think it's going to be the good news is basically I think the Russians are tired of their involvement there, given the other problems that they have at home with their economy. So the United States does not want to get rid of Assad like they talked about earlier. So I think that they can come to some sort of agreement to deal with this. The United States and Russia have a lot of other issues. For example, the extension of the New START agreement, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces agreement. So I think if they can work those out, this can be part of it. But it's not going to be easy. And President Trump basically wants to cut down American involvement around the world. And up to him, we would have been out of Syria completely by now. So it's going to be very, very difficult to make that happen. So hopefully you can come to some sort of agreement. I have more optimism about the Geneva process than the Astana, and basically get some sort of ceasefire that's not acceptable to everybody, but at least stops the killing for now.
Okay. We've got the final 2 minutes of this segment. I want to get final comments from Fadel, Ammar, and Omar. So please, gentlemen, if you can keep it brief, all of you, I'd appreciate it. Fadel, Geneva, a better process than Astana, according to Larry. You agree with that?
Without pressure, Assad will not implement at all with any negotiation. He's just wasting time with his allies, the Russian included, and the Iranian as well. Just what's happened in Ghouta, sees Ghouta again, sees Daraa, Homs. Now only the remaining is Idlib, and still now today is shelling Jisr al-Shughur and keep firing Idlib as well, killing civilians. So without pressure, real pressure, economic and political, and if that not succeed, we'll need to move to the military pressure based on the UN League actually, and that's based on Chapter 39, 41, and 42.
The Americans?
If it's out of the coalition, out of the UN, same what's happened is in Bosnia through NATO, that will be also accepted.
But that's NATO versus Russia.
Yeah, to protect the civilians actually in Syria, not against the Russian, but to protect the human rights protection, allowed military intervention, and allowed sanction, and allowed. Without that, Geneva will fail, and it's failed now. It's 10 rounds without any achievement at all, even release one prisoner.
Right. Ammar.
Yeah, people can have as much wishful thinking as they like. What we hear actually that President Assad is being recognized as being there for a long time, and this is official, and this is coming from high-ranking officials throughout, the world. And I really cannot see what the Syrian government can be pushed to do with whatever pressure. I mean, they've been trying to push it to do something for the past 8 years with tremendous pressure, with arming of militia and whatever, and nothing happened. So the best way forward is to get some common interests woven between certain countries. Definitely the Astana process is a way forward, much better than Geneva. Geneva, the people who are sitting at the other side of the table in Geneva, we have to understand they're not recognized by the Syrian people. They don't represent much, and we can't, put them into much hope, to be honest.
Omar, wrap us up.
So I would say we have only the Astana process because Geneva was basically dead, and that Turkey and the United States of America Syrian policy drive apart from each other. So I think if the US has an interest in reintegration the Geneva process, the US needs to sort out its difference with Turkey over the Syrian branch of the PKK. And until now, despite its mistakes and failures and weaker sides, the Astana process is the only efficient international process regarding Syria.
Okay, we'll keep a close eye on the proposed peace talks, see what comes out of it. For the moment, let me thank you, gentlemen, Fadel Abdulghani, Ammar Waqaf, Omar Özkazilcik, and Lawrence Korb. Thanks so much for joining us. Still to come, is social media driving us to despair? We take a look at how our addiction to likes is hurting our health. And entry denied, the US Bars BDS founder Omar Barghouti from flying to the States. We'll ask the man himself what he thinks is behind it. We all use it, but how often do we consider the consequences? I'm talking about social media and whether too much time spent using it could actually be bad for us. While studies show that some online connection can be beneficial to teenagers, several others point to a rise in anxiety, loneliness, and depression. And in the most extreme cases, the excessive use of social media has been linked to suicides. Recently, a UK court ruled that a 12-year-old schoolgirl, Jessica Scatterson, who took her own life in 2017, had what was described as intense social media activity in the days before her death. So, does social media pose a risk to our mental health? Well, to discuss this, let's go to our panel of experts in the UK who've studied social media use and its impact on teenagers. I'm joined from Colchester by Cara Booker. She's a researcher at the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Essex. And in Leicester, we have Michelle O'Reilly, a senior psychology lecturer at the University of Leicester. I thank you both for joining us. Let's focus on young people, especially teenagers. Michelle O'Reilly, is social media directly responsible for teen suicide?
I think it's a bit of a leap to say it's directly responsible for teen suicide. I think suicide is actually quite a complex issue related to mental health issues in children and young people, and no single factor can be held responsible in such a direct way. However, it can certainly be a contributing factor for some more vulnerable groups of young children and young people. So it's certainly something we should be paying attention to, but blaming it so directly is probably inappropriate.
So, Cara Booker, can we say, firstly, would you agree with Michelle? And if we dial it back a little bit, if you are susceptible or vulnerable, is social media a bad thing for you because it might push you over the edge?
I completely agree with what Michelle said, that we can't say that there's any real causation. There's been correlation studies, but we can't directly say that social media is causing an uptick in suicides, or is, I think we can say that in certain cases, maybe that there is a link between social media and well-being, but I don't think that we can say that it's necessarily directly related to, to suicide.
Yeah, and I appreciate your commitment, both of you, to the empirical research out there and saying, you know, it's just too early to tell. We don't absolutely know for sure. Michelle, teenagers, boys will be boys. They'll bully other boys. They'll gang up on people. They'll bully girls. They'll slut shame them, if you like. Girls will gang up on other girls and be mean and so on. But when we add a digital space to that, and we add the narcissism and the need for validation and all of that, does it make it too much for a young mind to handle?
I mean, there is certainly evidence that suggests that cyberbullying has a greater impact on children's mental health than just face-to-face. So there is some truth in that statement to an extent. But what I guess we have to remember, what happens is for most cases of bullying, the young person is being bullied in the physical space, in the playground, in the school, and then they go home and that gets extended beyond the school environment, and they get bullied online through social media. And so what happens is you get a much more sustained impact of the bullying than we used to get before social media came to be. So the cyberbullying studies do suggest that actually the intensity and duration of the bullying is what is the issue, because the child can't escape from those nasty comments, from those mean online comments, and that's what makes it a little bit more impactful than the good old days where it was just in the playground. Yes.
Right. Okay, so Kara, we can't compartmentalize anymore because that just continues. We're in the matrix. You have your smartphone on all the time. You have your iPad at home. This thing just never ends. Is that it?
I think that's true. I mean, if you look at the average amount of time that young people are on social media, it's, you know, somewhere between 3 and 4 hours, and that seems like a lot, and it is a lot. And so, you know, we're always checking, and it might not be constant. It's constant throughout the day. So you might check in the morning when you get up. You may or may not be allowed to have your phone at school, but you might try and sneak in a few minutes here or there. And then when you get home and you're not with your friends, you're constantly contacting them. So I do think that it is one of those things where it is, it's much more constant in our lives than anything else has been.
Right. Kara, as we're trying to figure out how to handle this, are we in uncharted terrain here? Do we actually know what the balance is, especially for teenagers?
I don't think we do, and I think this is kind of a two-pronged issue. We as adults are looking at young people on social media all the time and kind of assuming that it's a bad thing. And when you talk to young people, you tend not to get the same picture. So I think that we don't exactly know what's going on. Social media might be part of the picture of why young people have lower well-being, but I don't think it's the full picture. And I think that we need to kind of look outside of it to see what else might be contributing to that.
Michelle, does it differ according to gender, broadly speaking?
I mean, there are some gender differences, but what we have to account for there is that there are also gender differences in terms of mental health conditions and the kinds of issues that girls face against the issues that boys face. The kind of research that we do have available shows that boys are much more likely to use YouTube and watch videos and play on video games, whereas girls are more likely to use the communication channels like Snapchat and Instagram. But it's a bit patchy, our knowledge of the gender differences. There's certainly a need to do more research there.
Right. Kara, I mean, I'm going to use this opportunity to disclose that my daughter just opened an Instagram account, right? And I'm a bit worried about it, right? So on the story feature, she posted this thing yesterday where people are supposed to rate her, whether they think she's chill or mean, pretty or ugly, smart or dumb, etc., right? And it was shared, and you could see people's ratings, and, you know, thankfully, all her friends all thought wonderful things of her, all her classmates, I guess, and her cousins, right? But I wondered what happens then if somebody says, you're ugly, you're dumb, you're mean, for a 13-year-old girl. Is that Is that a perfect recipe for a problem to start, because this is just so easy where you're throwing stuff out there on Instagram?
I think it can be an issue, and I think this might be where parents come into play. I mean, you may not know everything that's going on, but if you see something like that, you may have a conversation with your child about what it means when somebody gives you a negative comment, or how to express themselves if they're starting to feel bad due to those comments. So yeah, I think if the children are taking this in without fully understanding what the context is and how to appropriately deal with any issues that they might have in dealing with the feelings that might come with negative comments, then I think that's where it might go down the road to having poor well-being.
So Michelle, does it boil down to just having mature conversations with your kids as a parent and taking it on a case-by-case basis, whether in the digital space or outside of it?
Parents certainly do play a role. I mean, I think, that, again, the research has shown that young people with parents who are open and communicate with their child certainly fare better than those who just ban social media from their child's life or are closed off to those kind of conversations. But I think we need to remember it's not just parents' responsibility, it's society's responsibility. You know, teachers play a role as well in educating children about how to stay safe online. You know, the community plays a role, the government certainly plays a role. So it's never just down to one individual. Right. In terms of their responsibility, we're all playing a role in what these young people think. And again, the teenagers we talk to, they're quite aware that negative comments come their way. It doesn't have to have a detrimental effect. It can, and it does for some, and some children are more vulnerable to those negative comments than others. But also, it's part of young people's life. They get negative comments in all kinds of environments. It's about how well equipped they feel they can cope with them, and the intensity of those comments, and who's making them, and for how long. So there's lots of things going on there. Right.
And Cara, I come from a generation where we would play video games in the arcade. We'd play Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat and shoot 'em up games, right? And back then, yes, there was this fear that, especially when boys play those games, you're going to turn out to be violent and you'll become someone who'll go and shoot up people later on, right? And so there were studies supporting that and so on. That was part of the debate of the time. Are we just having a similar debate now where you have some people who are all or nothing? They're saying either social media is completely bad or it's a total liberation, yet the answer's somewhere in the middle.
I think the answer is somewhere in the middle, but I do feel like we're having the same debates over and over again. Every time some new piece of technology comes out, we have to debate whether it's good or bad. You know, there's all of this debate about television and how television was bad for you. And in some cases, it has shown that it's had some negative effects, especially people just sitting down and being sedentary. But on the other hand, it showed that it brought many families together because they were able to come around a specific program and have a chat about that, or watch something at the same time together. So I don't think any of this is either one or the other. It's somewhere in the middle. And yes, we kind of are rehashing the same old things about new technologies and how we deal with them and how they fit into our lives.
Michelle?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think sometimes it depends on the child, on the young person, how vulnerable they are to particular effects. And sometimes it depends how resilient they are and how well they're able to cope. They can certainly use social media in positive ways. We've found that with the young people we've been talking to, that it can de-stress them. It helps them to cope with the other pressures and demands on life. And I guess, you know, social media is quite a new thing. We're catching up. So in the research world, we're trying to catch up and learn about this phenomena. And the same in society. Parents are trying to catch up with what's going on in their kids' lives. So there's certainly more work to be done to understand this issue better.
Would you, Cara, regulate social media or regulate it further given the available evidence on its impact on young people?
Given the available evidence, I wouldn't. I think there's so much that we don't know. We don't know a lot about the content that young people are watching and how that might have any association or impact on their well-being, the context in which they're doing it, whether they're creating content or whether they're just casual watchers. I think there's a lot more questions that need to be answered before we can make a definitive decision for an entire generation and generations to come about what we do with social media.
Michelle, be cautious about regulation because we just don't know.
I think we do need to be cautious, because I think that the risk is if you over-regulate, you actually take away some of the support systems for some children. So, you know, the idea about self-harm is that, if we stop children communicating about self-harm online, we'll solve the problem, but that's simply not true. You know, some young people who are self-harming are using social media to actually get support, get help, learn about it. And you risk taking that away. So yes, on one hand, it could make the case worse for some, but it might make it better for others. And until we have a better understanding of these complex issues and these relationships, I think if we could step in too quickly.
Okay. It's been an interesting discussion with both of you, Kara Booker and Michelle O'Reilly. I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers. A prominent pro-Palestinian activist, Omar Barghouti, has been barred from entering the United States. Barghouti was stopped at Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion airport and prevented from boarding his US-bound flight earlier this month, despite having valid travel documents. He says the US consulate told airline staff his entry had been denied by the US Immigration Department, even though he's been traveling back and forth for years. Barghouti co-founded the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, or BDS, which tries to exert financial and social pressure on Israel until it complies with international law. Several US states have introduced laws to hamper the movement, which Israel refers to as extremist and anti-Zionist. Well, Omar Barghouti joins us now from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Good to have you on the program. Omar, was there an exact reason that they gave you for why they weren't letting you go to the United States?
Actually, they did not give any specific reason. They just said immigration issues, and they never explained what those issues were.
Do you think for sure that this is about BDS?
Absolutely, yes. Israel is outsourcing its micro-repression of human rights defenders who are active in the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement for Palestinian rights. It's the first time that they outsource such a micro-level attack on BDS to the United States government, which is a xenophobic, right-wing, anti-Palestinian government that is completely complicit in Israel's crimes against Palestinians.
Right. There was a congressman, Republican, from New York, Lee Zeldin, who said, and I quote, the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel hate throughout the world in our nation, on college campuses and within the halls of Congress must be rejected. Barghouti's anti-Israel and anti-Semitic hate must not be tolerated, empowered or embraced. And I applaud the administration's denial of his entry to the United States. What's your response to the congressman?
Israel's far-right regime and its far-right supporters in the United States are so desperate because of the BDS movement's growth. Its impact has reached mainline churches, trade unions, student governments across tens of campuses in the US. Many Jewish millennials have joined BDS, and this is something that really worries Israel's far-right regime. Young Jewish people can no longer reconcile their liberal values with what Israel and Zionism stand for today. The siege of Gaza, ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem and the Naqab, the continuous construction of illegal settlements, apartheid laws, and so on and so forth. This has led Israel to redefine, to adopt a revisionist definition of anti-Semitism that focuses on opposition to Israel's policies and to Zionism. No one should conflate opposition to Israel's ideology and policies with anti-Jewish bigotry. The BDS movement is anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It rejects all forms of racism, including Islamophobia, including anti-Semitism. So Israel is trying to confuse those two issues and to say that opposition to Israel equals opposition to Jewish persons. And this is absolutely false. Right. At the same time, in parallel, Israel has become a kind of a poster boy for the anti-Semitic groups around the world, from the White House to Bolsonaro in Brazil, to Orban in Hungary, to many other regimes that are very far-right and very anti-Semitic. They're Israel's best friends in the world.
Yeah, and just looking at BDS as it's grown over the years, especially over the past decade or so, as BDS has gotten bigger and bigger, you have chapters on campuses around the world, from the west to the east to places like South Africa and so on. Is it difficult to control who claims to be BDS? And does this not make it easier for those who are anti-BDS to find stuff to use against you? A few examples. There were Facebook groups that were clearly anti-Semitic, claiming to be BDS. In South Africa, there were those who claimed to be supporting BDS that took a pig's head and put it in the kosher section of Woolworths, right? So they were claiming to be BDS. They might not have been endorsed by you or by BDS leadership, but it's easy for Israel to say, you see, these people are anti-Semites. They want the destruction of Israel. They don't care about human rights. This is something dressed up as a secular human rights organization, but it's something more nefarious. Is that a challenge you have?
Not really. It's a propaganda challenge that Israel puts out. The global BDS movement is not a vertical structure. It's very horizontal, true. It's very decentralized, that's absolutely true, but it has a leadership. The Palestinian BDS Committee leads this global movement, and the Palestinian BDS National Committee is the largest coalition in Palestinian society. We set the guidelines for the movement and the red lines for the movement. And some of those red lines have to do with racism, have to do with all kinds of discrimination, anti-Black, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Jewish, and all kinds of discrimination are rejected by the BDS movement. So when a when a group claims to be part of BDS and puts out any anti-Semitic content on their Facebook, we contact them immediately and we tell them, either you take down the anti-Semitic content and apologize about it and educate about our position against racism, or you're no longer part of the BDS movement. We took that position against a group in Casablanca in Morocco that's calling itself BDS Casablanca. We immediately issued a statement after warning them for a whole week that they are not part of the BDS movement, they have nothing to do with us, and we condemn the racism. So no, we don't take lightly any kind of racism, including anti-Jewish racism. But as I said, Israel is in no place to criticize anti-Semitism anywhere in the world when it's a hub for the anti-Semites of the world.
Right. The Israeli push in the war of ideas is to delegitimize the delegitimizers, as one Israeli academic told me. Who's winning in this war right now?
Israel is delegitimizing its own regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. By shifting so much to the far right, the next Israeli government will most likely include openly fascist parties. There are many fascist parties that are not open, but it might include an openly fascist party. Israel is losing the liberal mainstream. As it wins xenophobic far-right regimes around the world, it's losing the liberal mainstream. So Israel's own policy, its own shift to the far right, is delegitimizing its own regime of oppression. It's revealing its true face to the world as an oppressive colonial regime. And that's helping, truly, BDS to grow around the world. I think BDS is growing among all social movements, trade unions, academics, artists. Just the last couple of years, we saw many artists join the cultural boycott of Israel. Academics, many student groups around the world, many young Jewish groups are joining the BDS movement, and that worries Israel's far-right regime. At the same time, they're winning the far-right. So they can congratulate themselves on winning such far-right regimes, but they're losing the liberal mainstream.
Right. And when I look at your proposed itinerary, when you were supposed to go to the US, you were supposed to speak at different events, do activism, but you were also supposed to attend your daughter's wedding, as far as I understand. Did you miss your daughter's wedding?
Yes, I did. My daughter's wedding was last Sunday, and I was forced to miss it, obviously, by this entry ban. But I did all my public speaking events via Skype. So I did not miss my events at NYU, both campuses, Washington and New York, my Harvard University, and crucially, an unprecedented talk, my first talk at a synagogue in Chicago, Tzedek Chicago Synagogue, where I addressed the Jewish community in Chicago and spoke very frankly about our position on anti-Jewish racism, that we rejected absolutely, and on Palestinian rights, and that there should be no conflation between advocacy for Palestinian freedom, justice, and equality and opposition to Jewish persons. There's absolutely no contradiction in that. And I think the absolute majority understood our message loud and clear, but that was a very important step for me to speak at a synagogue.
Yeah, and of course, it's very important to you to get your message across to the United States. It sounds very dear to you and sounds like an important place in the culture war, if you like, to get your ideas out there. As things stand, we have professors who are being forced to commit to, or being asked to commit to, never endorsing BDS as a part of their job. We have more than half of the states which have anti-BDS legislation on the books. With that in mind, what's your message to the American people?
I think the American Civil Liberties Union said it very eloquently, said those anti-BDS laws adopted by some 27 state legislatures across the United States are reminiscent of McCarthy-era loyalty oaths. That's a very, very strong statement coming from the most important, the most influential liberal entity in the United States, the ACLU. Indeed, most libertarians, most human rights activists, most social movements around the United States view Israel's induced anti-BDS legislation in the US as extremely serious, as an attack on the US Constitution, the First Amendment of the US Constitution, which is the Free Speech Amendment. And they understand that, like McCarthyism in the 60s, the new Israeli McCarthyism in the US will not stop at BDS. If they succeed with suppressing free speech on Palestine, no one is safe. They will go after the Black rights movement, the LGBT movement, the indigenous movement, the women's movement, and any other movement that they deem inappropriate. They will go after it to try to suppress its freedom of speech. And that's why we see many liberals across the US, even those who do not support BDS, defending the right to BDS. For example, Senators Bernie Sanders and Dianne Feinstein in the US Congress have defended the right to call for a boycott of Israel to achieve Palestinian rights under international law.
Omar Barghouti, great to have you on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much for joining us. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Do remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, will Sunday's election in Spain give rise to the anti-immigration Vox Party? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.